Today, as we wander through this sermon, I want you to be able to follow the thinking of this. First of all, God gave to us creation, to have dominion over it, to be the stewards of creation, and that was good. And then we didn't take as good a care of it as we should have. But as it always is with God, there's another chapter. We call that chapter forgiveness. But we're going to start with talking about creation. Way back near the turn of the last century, the American poet James Weldon wrote a poem called The Creation. It's one of the classics of American literature, and I'm sure that most of you studied it in school or have read it at one time or another, and I'm going to be reading it today with some help, not reading, but some music that goes right along with it, as Phoebe plays a piece called Asteroids, written by a woman by the name of Jennifer Linn. So, the creation. And God stepped out on space, and he looked around and said, "I'm lonely. I'll make me a world." And far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything. Blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other, and God said, "That's good." And then God reached out and he took the light in his hands, and God rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun, and he set that sun ablazing in the heavens. And then the light that was left over from making the sun, God gathered up into a shining ball, and he flung it against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and the stars. And then down between the darkness and the light, he hurled the world. And God said, "That's good." Then God himself stepped down, and the sun was on his right hand, and the moon was on his left, and the stars were clustered about his head, and the earth was under his feet. And God walked, and where he trod, his footsteps hollowed the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. And then he stopped. And he looked, and he saw that the earth was hot and barren. So God stepped over to the edge of the world, and he spat out the 7 seas. And he battered his eyes, and the lightnings flashed, and he clapped his hands, and the thunders rolled, and the waters above the earth came down. The cooling waters came down. then the green grass sprouted, and the little red flowers blossomed, and the pine tree pointed his finger to the sky, and the oak spread out his arms, and the lakes cuddled down into the hollows of the ground, and the rivers ran down to the sea, and God smiled again, and the rainbow appeared and curled itself around his shoulder. And then God raised his arm, and he waved his hand over the sea and over the land, and he said, bring forth. And quicker than God could drop his hand, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the seas and the rivers, roamed the forests and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, that's good. And then God walked around, and God looked around on all that he had made. He looked at his sun, and he looked at his moon, and he looked at his little stars. And he looked on his world with all its living things, and God said, I'm lonely still. Then God sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river, he sat down with his head in his hands. God thought, and he thought, till he thought, I'll make me a man. Up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay, and by the bank of the river he kneeled him down. And there, the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the stars, and flung the stars to the most far corner of the night, who rounded the earth in the palm of his hand, this great God, like a mammy bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay till he shaped it in his own image. And then into it, he blew the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Amen. Isn't she something?